My name is Summa. I was on the research team, so this is my progress report on Open-NIM. Um, so yeah, Open-NIM is a open source solution to very easily deploy machine learning models and AI frameworks and stuff scalably using Kubernetes and Docker for the bulk of the background of it. So the objectives are basically to allow developers to, like I said, easily deploy AI models via Kubernetes with very basic YAML files. So actually my caption did an update, but basically this picture here shows a very basic version of basically one of the YAML files that will be generated from again, this is a very basic example. This is kind of the simplest possible Kubernetes cluster that can be made with it. But the point of it is basically to show that these files are kind of annoying to manually type. So compared to the pictures on the next slide that show some of the, again, very bare bones basic versions of the Open-NIM files, it shows that you have to type 2 lines versus 30 for a Kubernetes file. Also, it allows simple ingress either via defined endpoints or API specifications that are already made for that whatever model you're trying to run or whatever library you're trying to use. And also to allow multiple models to run in containers for, again, easy scaling and some amount of sandboxing. That's not really the point of Kubernetes, but it still lets a little bit of sandboxing happen. The progress that was made, there's currently very simple and easy to parse and read files that are used to generate the clusters. You can see right here, the simplest Open-NIM file, which is the first picture over here, shows that you basically only need a name and then the engines. You have to have a source of the engine, basically where the engine file is located. But other than that, all the configs are optional, the directories are optional. These are all just things that can also be added on top of it. It also has partially implemented auto endpoint generation. It's not completely finalized or anything yet, but it's the very basics of it are working. And you only need to basically run a single command to get it deployed. You can just specify in the single command the Open-NIM file, and then everything else it will you can automatically have it generate. By default, it will automatically deploy. It will automatically build the Docker containers that need to be built, all that sort of thing. So again, in this one, you can see examples I had of a very basic engine file where it basically just has the name of the engine, any metadata that you want the Kubernetes cluster to have, which or the Kubernetes file to have, which again, you don't need to have any of that. Any config values that if you specify them, they can be passed on to the engine that you're running. And then just the directory where the Docker file is located. And then again, if you have any endpoints, you can manually specify them at this point, or let the Postman API, if you have one of those set up automatically, generate the endpoints for you. So I don't have a demo for it because, like I said, it's basically just running a single command. So there's not actually that much to show about it. But the skills that I learned or experienced while I was doing this were mainly Kubernetes and Docker. There were both things that I had a little bit of experience with, more so Docker, but haven't really used before. So the big thing was just learning how they work, learning how they interact, learning how to use Python libraries to interact with them, and the different kind of a little bit more subtle stuff about Docker Compose versus Docker Build and stuff like that, where there's slightly different versions of Docker files I had to deal with and make sure all of that would be able to function. Also Postman, again, I hadn't really used that before, so it was interesting to learn how to what that was, how to use that to kind of figure out some stuff about endpoints, all that sort of API spec stuff. I haven't really worked on writing any APIs, writing any API specs before. I mostly just used APIs that already existed, and or if I had to make my own quote unquote API for something, it was just something super basic for a web app or something I was writing for my own personal use. So I never had a full on spec for it. So had to learn how to use that as well. And then also just developing an easy to use command line interface. Most again of the stuff that I've written have been if I wanted to change what the code was doing, I could have it split into functions, but I'd have to just go in and edit whatever the main file was to modify what functions I was calling when I ran it. So having an actual thing where I can pass in command line args and flags and all that sort of thing has been something I hadn't really messed with before. But yeah, so the roadblocks were basically mainly that stuff. Had to learn Kubernetes, especially the ingress stuff, which isn't like the most clearly documented, and they've had some different versions of it that have kind of changed a decent amount of it between like the current version and some of the previous ones. So some of the tutorials and whatnot online aren't like the most up to date. And then same thing with Docker, like the Docker Compose versus the other types of Docker. It was like a little bit hard to figure out at first to how to actually get it set up and working with Kubernetes and working with the Python library. But again, it wasn't anything super hard. It was just needing to learn Docker. But yeah, actually like developing it and figuring out the requirements and the functionality and like how to make a easy to use command line interface and like documentation for it, all that stuff is super interesting. It was like fun to kind of figure out how to develop it in a way that it was simple to use and simple to make the files for, but still allowed enough customization and all that sort of thing to be useful and like generally applicable to a wider variety of things and not just like one specific use case. But then actually learning Kubernetes is like any kind of new software that you're learning is can be annoying, especially when it's something like Kubernetes, which is like so big and tries to handle so many uses and like it's designed to be extremely scalable and all this sort of thing where it's like very good for what it does, but it's a big like initial threshold to pass to be able to use it like somewhat competently. But yeah, so in a conclusion, just being able to develop an open source alternative to the proprietary like NVIDIA NIM is great. It's like the sort of projects that I look for whenever I'm working on like my own project or just trying to find software to use, stuff like that. I always try and find if there is one, even if it's not as feature-fledged at the beginning or whatever, some sort of open source software that lets me, kind of potentially contribute to it, like use a community-driven one, kind of know what I'm running, that sort of thing. It's something I always appreciate. So it's nice to be able to develop something like that that could hopefully be useful.